One small mistake, a single miscalculation, and disaster unfolds. I'm Eckhard Jan, and this is Arrow 1. Today we're diving deep into one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Today we're talking about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. On the evening of March the 23rd, 1989, an oil tanker belonging to the oil company Exxon docked in Valdez, a port city in Alaska. Its name, Exxon Valdez. The 987-foot vessel was loaded with around 1.2 million barrels of crude oil, equivalent to just over 200 million liters or 53 million gallons. It departed from the Alaska pipeline terminal at 9:12 p.m. Its destination was the port of Long Beach in California. No one anticipated any issues that night. Thousands of similar voyages had been completed successfully before. However, conditions were far from ideal. Visibility was poor due to fog and light snowfall, and the temperature hovered around freezing. Earlier that day, the U.S. Coast Guard had issued an iceberg warning for the planned route. In response, Captain Joseph Hazelwood coordinated with the Vessel Traffic Center to alter the ship's course. He also mentioned plans to slow down to 12 knots, though this never happened. At approximately 11:52 p.m., Hazelwood handed control over to third mate Gregory Cousins, instructing him,
"Call me as soon as we pass the Busby Island warning beacon."
The plan was to adjust the course back to the original path after the deviation. The ship veers off course to avoid the mentioned icebergs, but never corrects its path in time. At 12:04 a.m., the Exxon Valdez slammed into Bligh Reef. The ship ran aground, tearing open its hull. Hazelwood returned to the bridge, assessed the situation, and radioed the control center. "Let's listen in."
Valdez traffic. We get some oil, and we're gonna be here for a while, and figure out a fight over it.
A gash opened in the ship's hull. Crude oil began to spill into the pristine waters of Prince William Sound. 10 of the ship's 16 tanks were damaged. Crude oil leaked out. Over the next few days, nearly 11 million gallons of crude oil leaked into the ocean, coating the coastline, devastating wildlife, and triggering an environmental catastrophe. Exxon estimated that 41 million liters of oil spilled uncontrollably into the sea. The consequences were devastating. Over 1,300 miles of coastline were contaminated, and the fragile ecosystem suffered immense damage. Hundreds of thousands of fish, 250,000 seabirds, sea otters, seals, 247 bald eagles, and 22 orcas died as a direct result of the spill. Decades later, remnants of oil can still be found on the coast. But this was no freak accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But what was it? What led to this accident? Let's take a look together at the error chain again. The story began in 1968 with the discovery of a massive oil reserve in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. As the largest oil deposit ever found in the United States, it held immense economic potential. However, Prudhoe Bay was in the far north along the Arctic Ocean, where waters remained frozen for much of the year. Transporting the oil south presented a logistical challenge. However, the U.S. government and oil companies wanted to exploit this valuable source of oil. They had to find a way how the oil could be transported from Prudhoe Bay to the south. The solution? A pipeline. The nearest ice-free port, Valdez, lay 800 miles to the south. After years of debate, President Richard Nixon authorized the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline on November 16, 1973. By June 1977, oil was flowing to Valdez, where it was loaded onto tankers like the Exxon Valdez for shipment to the mainland. To ensure safe passage, shipping lanes were established, one for northbound vessels entering the port and another for southbound departures. The right lane leads north into the bay, and the left lane leads south into Prince William Sound. The crews were instructed to stay in their routes or lanes. However, due to the iceberg warning, Hazelwood requested permission to deviate from the assigned lane. The request was granted, as no other ships were approaching that night, so they were allowed to deviate. Navigating through straits is inherently risky, particularly at night. Limited visibility makes precise maneuvering crucial. There is little room to maneuver, and crews have to be extremely careful. The Exxon Valdez needed to make a minor course adjustment to return to its designated lane, much like a car overtaking another on a highway. However, Hazelwood had already retired to his cabin, leaving third mate Gregory Cousins in charge during this critical phase. Around midnight, Cousins began maneuvering the ship onto the other lane. He attempted to steer the ship back onto its original path, but he failed to notice how far off course they had drifted. The vessel had strayed beyond safe limits and was heading straight for Bligh Reef at full speed. Realizing the mistake, Cousins immediately called the captain. "I think we're in serious trouble," he warned. But before Hazelwood could act, the disaster unfolded. At 12:04 a.m., the Exxon Valdez ran aground. Shortly after, Captain Hazelwood informed the control center. We had just heard the radio message. His speech sounded odd, slow, and erratic. There was a reason for that. He was intoxicated. Or to put it another way, he was seriously drunk. A blood test the following morning revealed a blood alcohol content of 0.09%. Back calculating to the time of the accident, experts estimated his level at over 0.2%, well beyond the legal limit for operating any vehicle. Hazelwood was an alcoholic, a level at which normal people would no longer be responsive, let alone capable of acting. But Hazelwood was no ordinary person. He was an alcoholic. Exxon had known about his drinking problem for years. 9 years before the accident, his superiors had already received several reports of his alcohol consumption while being in charge on board other Exxon ships. In 1985, a crew member formally complained about his behavior. The personnel manager of the Exxon Shipping Company was forced to initiate an investigation. Exxon too placed Hazelwood in a 28-day rehabilitation program at South Oaks Hospital in Amityville, New York. His superiors knew that the treatment was for alcohol abuse. After 28 days, the doctors recommended that he attend an aftercare program and enroll in Alcoholics Anonymous. Doctors recommended lifelong sobriety, but Hazelwood relapsed. He lost his driver's license multiple times due to DUI offenses, yet his superiors ignored the problem. Exxon continued to entrust him with one of its largest oil tankers, the Exxon Valdez, one of the largest vessels of the Exxon fleet. Shockingly, his re-employment interview had taken place in a bar. During the Exxon Valdez's final voyage, Hazelwood was legally unfit to drive a car, yet he commanded of one of the world's largest vessels. But how can you let a known alcoholic take the wheel of an oil tanker? Hazelwood was in his cabin during the most critical phase, possibly to sleep off his intoxication. Another critical issue was crew fatigue. Third mate Gregory Cousins was in command on the bridge. He was eagerly pursuing his career path and never said no when his help was needed. The investigation revealed that third mate Gregory Cousins had been awake since 5 a.m. the previous day. Officers were supposed to have 6-hour shifts, followed by 6-hour rest periods. The third mate had only a short break once at noon for roughly 45 minutes before helping out again. However, it was common practice and even expected that you would help out on board, even if you are legally off duty. This was especially true when cargo, such as crude oil in this case, was being loaded. The investigators found that Cousins had only managed about 4 hours of rest in the 24 hours leading up to the accident. The investigation commission came to the conclusion that Gregory Cousins was completely overworked and fatigued while he was in command of the Exxon Valdez. Now we should ask ourselves why the third mate did not get enough rest and why he had to work overtime. The minimum crew of such a ship is 18 seamen, including the captain and 3 officers. Exxon had received a special permit allowing them to reduce the minimum crew size to 15, cutting costs. While this might be manageable on long open-sea voyages, it left crews overstretched on shorter, high-risk routes between Alaska and California. The investigators concluded that Cousins was simply too exhausted to react properly during the crisis. If we take all the extensive work and tasks into account while the ship is in port, only proves that the crew was clearly understaffed. The investigation commission came to the conclusion that the long-established number of crew members was reduced in order to save cost. As a result, seamen often have to work at maximum duty hours. Another question is why the Vessel Traffic Center, the onshore control center, was not able to warn the Exxon Valdez in time. It was a quiet evening at the control center and there was little for the guards to do. The radar that was switched on had a range that could have immediately shown the route of the Exxon Valdez without any problems. Unfortunately, the guard in charge had forgotten to change the range from short range to long range. They lost radar contact with the Exxon Valdez shortly before the ship changed direction. Although the guards at the Vessel Traffic Center had the task of monitoring ships and their routes, they failed to do so that night. If the Exxon Valdez had been monitored properly by radar, the crew could have been warned about the reef. This alone could have prevented the accident. There was a consortium of various oil companies to drill oil in Prudhoe Bay. They joined forces to operate the pipeline to Valdez. Exxon and other oil companies had been aware of the risks. A consortium of oil firms, including Exxon, regularly discussed potential spill scenarios. At a meeting just 10 months before the accident, they acknowledged that an oil spill in Prince William Sound would be nearly impossible to clean up. Despite this, they chose not to invest in preventative measures. Later, the total costs were a multitude of what they expected to save. Adding to the problem was the ship's design. The ship size was almost 1,000 feet long, or 300 meters, 50 meters wide, and had a draft of around 20 meters. A lot of steel is needed to build such a huge tanker. The Exxon Valdez was built between 1985 and 86 at the National Steel and Shipbuilding Company in San Diego. The Exxon Valdez, like many tankers of its time, had a single hull construction. This made it highly vulnerable to punctures. In 1990, following the disaster, U.S. law mandated that all new oil tankers be built with double hulls to reduce the risk of spills. Vessels for the transport of oil with a single hull would not be permitted anymore. Legislators hoped that this would prevent oil disasters in the future. Immediately after the accident, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation and presented its final report on July 31, 1990. It concluded that the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The Exxon Valdez spill was not a singular error. It was a chain of preventable mistakes. According to NTSB, the disaster resulted from an overworked third mate who was too fatigued to properly navigate. He could no longer maneuver the ship with the required attention. A failure at the Vessel Traffic Center to monitor the ship's course. Last and most importantly, a captain incapacitated by alcohol who should never have been in command. Hazelwood was unable to monitor the navigation due to alcohol consumption. Exxon Shipping Company had failed to provide a suitable captain, sufficient personnel, and a well-rested crew. For at least 3 years, Exxon's managers knew that Captain Hazelwood had started drinking again. They knew he was drinking aboard their ships and knew he was driving while intoxicated. During the entire time, Exxon did nothing to stop him from drinking and driving. Instead, they used Hazelwood to drive the largest ship in their fleet, fully loaded, through the critical Prince William Sound. Exxon was sued and sentenced for its many failings. Exxon was originally fined $5 billion, but Exxon filed appeal after appeal and litigated until they ended up in the Supreme Court 20 years after the oil spill. Finally, the fine was reduced to $500 million, about 4 days' worth of Exxon's profits. The people of Alaska, still grappling with the environmental and economic fallout, were left with little justice. The region and its people have still not recovered from the damages. Local fishermen said they had lost 20 years of herring fishing, but had only been compensated for a single year. In the long term, animals gradually become poisoned through ingestion, as oil residues are only slowly broken down in the cold environment. Fishing on a normal scale was still not possible 30 years later. There is one last question we should clarify. How did it come that the decision to send oil tankers through a critical and dangerous strait instead of extending the pipeline completely to the south come about in the first place? After the discovery of this extremely productive oil source, there were 5 years of debate in the USA as to whether the port of Valdez was suitable or whether it would not be safer and more sensible to lay the pipeline directly to the USA. It would then have to run right across Canada. Even laying the pipeline through Alaska would not be unproblematic. To make this possible, the consortium needed several exemptions from environmental regulations. Only the U.S. Senate was allowed to make such a decision. There was a tough struggle. The vote resulted in a 49-49 tie. In stalemate situations, the U.S. Vice President decides. It was only with the additional vote of Republican Vice President Spiro Agnew that the construction of the pipeline to Valdez was approved. Could the Senate or Vice President have foreseen how high the risk of an accident would be? Since the mid-1950s, oil transportation by ship had been on the rise. By 1973, when the decision was taken in the Senate, there had already been 18 tanker accidents worldwide, statistically 1 accident almost every year. Together they had lost 900,000 tons of oil in the world's oceans. In other words, it could not be ruled out that an accident would occur in critical areas such as Prince William Sound. This was error 1. Now I'm sure you understand why I always advocate tracing the error chain back to the beginning, because everything begins for a reason. And that's it for this episode of Error 1. If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. And remember, small mistakes can have massive consequences. If you want to learn more about this concept, you can download my award-winning book Error 1 or just visit www.error1.net. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.